professor in tribology and service engineering and the director of the MB rights. So now we will give him the chance to continue his talk. Welcome, Doctor.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ali, for a kind introduction. Again, thank you for having me. So much appreciated and much grateful for colleagues at KKU. So welcome, everyone. Good evening. Greetings from Leeds in the UK. Just looking out of the window, very gloomy and rainy today. But anyway, very, very happy to be here with you tonight. And also thank you for all the emails and comments I got from you after yesterday evening. Some good questions there and very, very, very helpful feedback. So thank you for that. Much appreciated. Okay, so let me just start by catching up with agenda. So just to remind you, yesterday we covered introduction to effective academic publishing, and then we finished somewhere in the middle of the second section, which was about writing, about sitting finally at some point and writing the paper. So the plan for tonight is to finish the second section and then go through the third section. And the fourth section, I have to say, on maximizing impact is very brief, just to finish off, just to give you some idea how to share your research and all that hard work that went into writing the paper. So we'll be mainly focusing on the second and third sections, which I think will give you most value from the author perspective. So before we pick up where we left, let me just go quickly through most important aspects of what we discussed yesterday, just as a quick reminder. So we really started with that reflection on the quote from Sir Francis Darwin, who said that the credit in science goes to the man who convinced the world about a discovery, and not really to the man who discovered something or to whom the idea first occurred. And we discussed the importance of publishing our findings and our experiments. Then in terms of context, we discussed actually how many papers out there and how many journals out there and how difficult it is to fight for attention, how difficult it is for researchers, for authors to be noticed. And it was a good context and background in terms of understanding the bigger picture of academic publishing. Then we move on to different publishing options, and we discussed closed access and open access. So typically we've been publishing in a closed access model, but more recently open access is gaining attention, and we discussed both gold and green open access options. So in gold, just to remind everyone, the author needs to pay the publisher the fee, and with that everyone can freely read the paper. However, with the green option, the author still can pay to the publisher and allow free access, but there is also another route through paper repositories where the author can upload their paper after publishing a proper version of that paper, which was accepted before final approval. And this copy of the paper can be downloaded by the readers directly from the repository after a certain time, currency time, after publishing, which is typically 6 to 12 months. I also mentioned about predatory journals, something I wanted to make you aware and something to remind you. If you get an emails asking you to submit to a certain journal and in the same time asking you to pay a publication fee, be careful. This might be one of the predatory journals which are really trying to trick you into open access model, which is not really helpful because you are just paying for getting into the journal, which doesn't have really good quality. So be careful and always double check those journals. Then we discussed authorship, and we mentioned, and we had some discussion around that graph that you can see on the slide. And typically with more authors on your paper, you get more exposure. And if you can add international authors, that's even better, because you increase your reach of your readers, of your audience. And with that, you can improve your citation metrics. Then we moved on to impact factor, and we explained how impact factor can be calculated for a journal. And then we had some discussion around mean impact factors in different fields. And we mentioned that anyone publishing in medicine, cell biology, by definition will get published in higher impact factors journals, because that's the nature of the discipline. And then moving on to more engineering-based, history, social science disciplines, the mean impact factor is somehow lower for those areas. After age index, something that can be applied to individuals as the researchers, institutes, and universities. And we discussed how age index is calculated, and we went through a few examples. And then I briefly mentioned about higher level of journal metrics, different generations, and we discussed that so far mainly we are using the first and second generation, but there are other generations coming up and getting more and more popular. And then we finished that first section with a reflection on the research cycle, what would be the ideal research cycle in terms of plan, discovery, analysis, writing, and sharing. And then we had a reflection that in real life, sometimes it might be very different, but still useful to relate that to that original model and understand what's the ideal research cycle. Okay, so then we moved on to the second part, which is about writing. And we started with the discussion about the story of the paper. And I explained the idea behind telling a story in the research paper, and the story which leads to the main message of the paper. And we discussed the importance of formulating that story and realizing what the main message of our paper is. And then towards the end of yesterday night, we started outlining all the sections of the paper, and we had a brief discussion about the paper. We discussed and compared shorter titles with those more descriptive, longer titles, and I show you some evidence in terms of relationship between citations and the number of words in titles. And that was the graph that we discussed yesterday. And in terms of abstract, I gave you a recipe, a 5-point recipe for a good abstract. What I mean good is an abstract which is very well received by the reader. It's engaging, and it's really convincing the reader to look at the rest of the paper and to read the entire paper. And we finish here with just explanation of what IMRAD is, but without really going into much detail. So this is where we are going to pick up tonight. So let's focus on IMRAD and let's start our discussion. So IMRAD name abbreviation comes from Introduction, Methods, Results, and Discussion. And this is the way of organizing paper in those 4 sections that you can see on the screen. And the special shape of that representation is important. And I'll explain in a minute why it's important and why that particular shape. Okay, but before I move on, let me explain, give you a bit of context, historical context to IMRAD, because IMRAD is a particular way of organizing paper, which was not always the case. So in this graph, you can see percentage of articles, papers published in medicine-related journals over the years, and you can see different formats of papers. including just continuous text, a case report, or partially IMRAT formats. And you can see that over years, different types, different formats of papers were getting less and less popular, and IMRAT structure was gaining a lot of popularity and attention. And from 80s, most of the papers are published with IMRAT structure, which is very helpful for the editors, very helpful for the authors, because we can speak the same language, and when we start writing the paper, we can straight away think about those main sections and how to organize them. So very useful system, which now is very popular and used across the board. Okay, so let's break down this IMRAT section into individual sections, and let's spend some time on discussing those sections individually. So introduction is the first in a series here, and I would like to highlight again that typical shape of introduction, at least in this graphical representation. So what is important here is that at the beginning of the introduction section, we start very broadly, hence you have a very wide shape at the top of that graphical representation. And then when you go along through the introduction section, when you write your introduction section, you go into more and more details, hence the characteristic shape of that introduction. So in terms of general paragraphs at the beginning of the introduction section, you will typically start introducing the field of research, and you will start asking the question, what is the problem, why this problem is interesting, why the reader should be really interested in that problem. So very, very broad introduction into the field of your research. Then moving on, when you go along and you write your introduction, the next part, the middle part, is where you get into more details. And you start looking at state of the art, you start citing literature, and you start explaining to the reader what has been done before in that field, trying to answer that question. Who are the main contributors? Who are the main research groups who's been working in that field already? And what they did in terms of the research, in terms of their publications. And this is the section where you refer to literature quite heavily in terms of references. So then towards the end of introduction section, you get into nitty-gritty and you get into a detail of what you are going to do. So you already established what's the in the literature, what's already established, and now you are highlighting what's the gap in that literature, and you are explaining that this gap is really important, and with your hypothesis, with your contribution, you will fill that gap in knowledge and in literature. And that brings you to the last paragraph, last sentence even of the introduction section, which typically starts with, in this study, and you explain what you are going to do in this study, in this paper. So when you write introduction, please remember about that shape. So you start with a general knowledge, general introduction to the field, and you then take your reader through more and more details, and finally you finish off with explanation what your study is about. So that's really important way of writing introduction section. And as you can appreciate, discussion section later on is somehow reversed in terms of the shape, and we will discuss this very soon. So again, the purpose of that slide is to highlight this even more in terms of that shape and in terms of starting very, very broadly and then going into detail. So again, you start with very distantly related work to your study, and you might refer to some general handbooks, some general knowledge. It's more to do with the topic of the area and the general field of your research. Then in the middle of the section, you get closer to what you are going to do, and you start with narrower categories of your research, and you go into detail. And at the very bottom, again, it's the research that is particularly related to your work. You relate to a few papers that will relate to your work directly, and you explain that that research gap, which you will fill with your study. It is important to be critical while writing introduction section. And what I mean by critical literature review, critical writing of the state of the art, is that you need to actively read and actively write your introduction by making some connections between different sources, comparing and contrasting different theories and positions. And really you are acting as an author which synthesize all the references that you read. So yesterday we discussed and explained that a good paper should have a story. So the introduction is very much beginning of that story, and it has to be a strong beginning with engaging explanation of why our paper is important and why our contribution is relevant for the reader. So writing a critical introduction and state of the art is difficult, is an art, but by reading many papers from your field and just trying to synthesize that knowledge, you can achieve that. So again, you agree with some statements from the literature, but you don't have to agree with all of them. You can defend some points of view, you can show some contrasting theories, and that will add value to your introduction. You can even reject some points of view and some references. You might cite some references, and you might highlight that maybe that was not the best approach to for that particular experiment or a theory. And introduction is really that part of the paper that you can do this. So after reading introduction section, the author should be left with a clear understanding of the background of your research, of the context of your research. That should have a clear answer to the question why that paper is important and what gap that paper fills. So I'm really preparing the reader for the next sections, which are your methods, results, and discussion. So it's absolutely critical part of the paper, and it is quite difficult to write. So one tool which can help you with that process of collecting and synthesizing your literature is this type of matrix, where you collect all your papers and then try to group them in some themes. So there will be always a few main themes within your introduction, and for each theme you might have a few papers, the key papers that you found in the literature. And with this type of matrix, you can just put all your papers in columns, and you can put all your themes in rows, and then make some notes about the main points from those papers related to those themes. And then, of course, that matrix can be extended towards right and extended towards the bottom. It can be very large matrix, but with that, it's much easier than to map this to your introduction and to capture those themes which were mentioned in different papers. So very good exercise. You might use it yourself. You can also encourage your students to use that matrix. One point to mention when writing the introduction is we are reading many papers, and very often we cite different papers, we refer to different papers, and maybe we want to refer to a particular paragraph or maybe even one sentence or two sentences from a paper. And what we should really avoid, you should be careful with, is plagiarism, and that's related to ethics in publishing. But we shouldn't be really quoting other research. What we should be doing is really read, understand, and then in our own words express that theme, that knowledge, that statement. So it's really about paraphrasing and summarizing research from other sources, and we need to be careful not to use the same syntax, because that might be problem in terms of ethics. Okay, let's move on and let's discuss the next section in the IMRAD framework, which is methods. So not much really creative here, to be honest. It just has to be very solid section in terms of explaining very, very clearly all the experimental, modeling, computational, or theoretical models, equipment, and materials that we use in our paper. The purpose of that is that any reader should be able to run the same experiment with the information captured in the method section. So we need to give sufficient detail of our experiments and our work. It just has to be solid description of our methodology. So moving on to results. The first comment I would like to do is that within IMRAD, the results section is not mixed with the discussion section. In some journals and some authors prefer to write those sections together, and they will entitle that results and discussion, and within their paper it will be one section. That's one approach, that's possible, and many journals accept that form of publication. However, within the framework of today's discussion and within the framework of IMRAD, we'll be discussing results separately from discussion so that we can clearly understand the features of those two sections and clearly focus on quality of them separately. So if that's the case, even if within the results we are only presenting results, in technical fields, it will be mainly presentation of figures in tables, just with some text between them, almost like a connecting tissue, just to explain the reader what they can see on the graphs, just to help them go through the results and the graphs and tables, but without interpretation. This is something we need to leave for the discussion. So in terms of text, figures, maybe some tables. Again, it all, of course, depends on the discipline. In social science, of course, the results will be mainly text and maybe just a few tables. But typically, we focus just on presenting our findings without much of interpretation. Because interpretation, in-depth interpretation, has to happen in this. And this is where really good papers can be distinguished from absolutely exceptional papers. I would say that the discussion section is most difficult to write, and perhaps this is why results sometimes are mixed with the discussion, because I think it's very difficult art to write this good discussion section, and I think some authors, by mixing results with discussion, they're trying to avoid a process of writing a very good, solid discussion. But good journals will, of course, spot that, and the editors and the reviewers will reject papers without good discussion. Because at the end of the day, if the results are not interpreted and not analyzed in depth, not compared with the literature, this is not really a scientific paper. I would say that this is more of a technical report than a research paper. So what really makes a difference between not so good paper and really good paper is really a discussion section. Okay, so with that short introduction to discussion, let's now discuss features of the discussion section. So Again, in terms of the shape, you might see that we start with a detail, and here by detail I mean we relate to our results, we look at them individually, we discuss them, we compare them, and then we go wider and wider, and finally finish with a bigger picture and context of our results within the discipline, within the science, and we explain the meaning, wider meaning of our results and our observations. So discussion section is again a place within the paper when we should be referring to literature quite often. So we make statements, we make observations from our paper, but we compare that with literature. So we might say that we observed a certain relationship, but very quickly we compare that relationship with available literature, and we show an evidence that maybe other authors observed similar relationship, or maybe they observed some slightly different relationship but in different conditions. And then this brings interesting and important points for the discussion, really increasing the value of the paper. So within the discussion, we'd like to analyze all our results, go through them, described, interpret really what's in the graphs, tables, or other form of results, and compare them with the literature, compare them with each other. If we have a few sections in the results part of the paper, within the discussion we can mix them all together and we can relate one to another. So, for example, excuse me for using a technical example, but if we measured hardness for the materials, and if we maybe measured toughness of the material and maybe other like corrosion properties, within the results sections it were sub-paragraphs and sub-chapters. But within the discussion we can mix all that together and explain how hardness can impact toughness and how that might relate to corrosion resistance. So it's really a place where we take all our results together and analyze them and interpret. So this is also where we can show the relationships between our results and the wider known theories and analysis from the literature. We might present some external theories and models. And we also want to explain implications of what we found in our paper. And this is really goes towards the end of the discussion section, where we want to relate to the bigger picture and bring reader back to the context of our research. Okay, hopefully that set the scene for the discussion. I like discussing this slide, which shows, I think, very well what is a simple description of the results with more in-depth interpretation. So I would say everything on the left in blue is really a technical report. We really just state what happened, we list details, we say how something changed. So we can say function A change, well, A increase when we increase B. Very simple observations, just notes on methods without going into much depth and interpretation, right? We just give information. But on the right-hand side in green, you can appreciate that we go much deeper into discussion of our results. We not only state what happened, but we identify the significance of that observation. We not only say how to do something, but we also can argue a case according to evidence and support this with a literature. We not only give information, simple information, but we also draw some conclusions from that information. Again, supporting this by the literature and appropriate references. So we give reasons, we indicate, we analyze, we show different points of view. We weigh one piece of information against another, and we really critically assess our results and discuss them within the framework of the existing literature. And this is what makes discussion really meaningful, and which can really improve the quality of the discussion section. And as you can appreciate, this is why it is so difficult to write, because you need to understand the field of your research very well. You need to understand the literature. And you need to understand all those nuances, so that you can interpret your results properly. So again, quite difficult, but certainly something that everyone can do if they spend enough time on reading and understanding that bigger picture. So that brings me to conclusions. So that discussion is the end of the IMRAD core part of the paper. But of course, after that, we have a few other sections which we'll discuss now, starting with conclusions. So a good conclusion always starts with a reminder of what was the problem. Before we jump into drawing conclusions in form of bullet points or some summaries, it's always good to remind what the problem was. And just remember that some readers will read your title of your paper, maybe abstract, and then maybe go straight away into conclusions and try to find out what was actually the main added value of the paper. So conclusions can be very often read as standalone section. So of course, with the conclusions, you want to offer a quick kind of checklist of main findings and the main message of the papers. If there is any reservations or limitations of your research in terms of maybe testing conditions or maybe models that you use, it's also a place that you should mention that. And I think over the next few slides, I have a framework, and I break down the conclusions into a few steps, and I support this with an example. So, as I said, it's good to start with a reminder of what the problem was of our paper. And this is an example of an actual paper. I just brought the conclusions of that paper into those points, just highlighting each feature in turn. So in that paper, of course, medicine, the authors were looking at tuberculosis and some, I think, vaccinations. So in the first sentence, they just remind the problem, that tuberculosis being a widespread disease, of course, affecting millions of people. So this is just a reminder of the fact that we are discussing an important problem. As the next step, we should remind what the hypothesis was, or what we wanted to achieve within that bigger picture. And in this example, authors go along with their conclusions, just explaining their piece of work and what was their hypothesis and what they wanted to achieve with their work. And at this point, only at this point, we can move on to our main message of the paper. So there will be always this main conclusion, the key point, the key finding in the paper. And of course, the main message should come out of our story that we discussed yesterday. And that will be the point that someone will remember after a few days, a few weeks after reading our paper. And that's the place where we can really highlight that main message. It's one main conclusion that we want to leave reader with. So that's the third point. And there will be also other results and consequences. In that case of that abstract, I don't expect anyone, of course, reading through that text, but it's just to show that in terms of volume of text, there is much more than previously. So there are all other most important results and their consequences that the authors go through. And this can be also presented in the form of bullet points, if you prefer, which is a very neat way of listing our conclusions in that part of the paper. And it's also good to finish conclusions again with a bigger context and maybe discuss some future research, or maybe include something which is called call to action. So if we want to have a reader left with any message, or maybe we want reader to do something as a result of reading our paper, towards the end of the conclusions is the right place to do this. If we want to describe our future research, so some potential other experiments or other investigation that we would like to do after publishing that paper, yes, we can do that, but we need to be careful not to list too many points there, because the reviewers might argue that maybe part of that work should be already done within this paper. So it's also it's good to give a glimpse of some future research, but perhaps not too detailed, just to give an impression that we understand what would be the next step and explain why. Of course, we have also acknowledgements in the papers. This is something that we don't really have to include in the paper, but my advice is that it's good to include acknowledgements, and there will be always someone that we can thank. It will be some people maybe we brainstormed the paper, maybe some technical assistance, maybe someone provided some materials, or maybe some sponsorship, and of course some funding bodies, especially government agencies, research councils, they require us to mention about the funding given. So we might even have to include that in acknowledgements. But if that's the case, there will be always some people that we can thank and acknowledge their help and support. And yesterday we discussed the authorship of the papers, and if you are not sure whether someone should be an author, whether their contribution was significant, that's also an option. You can always thank those people in the acknowledgements for their help and support. So coming back to PhD comics, something I mentioned yesterday, this is an analysis what authors write in acknowledgements, which is a left-hand column, and on the right-hand side is really what they mean by writing this. So there might be thanking some people, editors or organizers of the conferences, but what they really want is maybe get some more funding, or they don't really mean it. But anyway, as usual, PhD comics, it's a good fun. Okay, so really to finish off with the reference, with the part of with all the sections of the paper. Of course, at the end of each paper we have references. It's not the part of the paper that we would actively write. It's not something that we would sit and write as a section. But it's still a very, very important section for the editors and for the reviewers. And both reviewers and editors would assess that section looking at the type of references and literature listed in that section. So what I mean by that is that it's important to cite all the significant and important references. It's important to appreciate what's the age of the papers that we cite. The science is developing nowadays very, very rapidly at the great pace. And if within our paper we cite only literature which is maybe 10, 20 years old, it won't be a good and strong signal to the referees. Perhaps they may come back with a comment that our state of the art and our literature review is outdated because we don't really review the recent literature and we don't cite recent papers. So that's something which can be very, very easily spotted by just going through the reference sections. Other points that can be picked up by editors or referees, for example, is wherever authors appreciated different groups across the world working in that field. So if I would cite only research groups from the UK in my paper on tribology, that would be not so much suspicious, but it would be really interpreted as a lack of understanding of what's going on in tribology around the world. And there is a significant research in tribology in the US, in Asia, Far East, and I need to be aware about those papers. And of course, the referees would expect that those papers will be cited as well. In terms of self citations, something that again can be easily spotted within the reference section. Of course, we shouldn't be avoiding self citations, but we shouldn't be doing this too much, and only as much as necessary, really. So if we work on the same type of problem that we already published, we already discussed in our previous papers, of course we want to cite that research, and of course we want to relate to that research, and we have to include that in references. But it's not really a place where we should be putting tens of our papers, dozens of our papers, just for the sake of it. If it's needed, yes, we can do that, but no more than that. So there's no magic number in terms of how many self-citations we can include in terms of percentage or number of papers, but if it is justified, then no problem. Of course, we can do that. Okay, so I think I explained the importance of that section. It's not only a list of papers, but so it's not only quantity that the reviewers will look at, but really a quality in terms of how old are the references, in terms of main research groups and geographical spread, and in terms of the most important papers well known within the field. In terms of formatting references, I don't want to spend too much time on this technical aspect. There's a number of resources across different libraries. There is Harvard style, there is Vancouver style. Every author just needs to be aware of what the required style is from a given journal and just follow the rules. And if any help is needed, then resources like the one here at Leeds University is really good in terms of how to cite a book, how to cite a PhD thesis, how to cite an online resource. All those rules I'll explain there. Okay, right. So we really went through all the sections of the paper. We started with title and we finished with references. So I hope I gave you a little bit of understanding of how those sections should be written, what is important in terms of features of those sections, so that you can split them and focus on them individually and just make sure that you understand what makes a good title, what makes a good introduction, what makes good discussion. So now moving on, I want to touch on a few aspects in terms of the workshop, in terms of the skills for the authors. And I want to start with the way of writing a paper using the paragraphs. It's a well-established method of writing any text, really, but I think very, very useful for writing papers.
Yes, you can appreciate that this is a very daunting task when we sit in front of the blank page and we need to write a paper. I mean, this is a massive task. And of course, IMRAD section helps with that process because we already have a breakdown. We know that we need to start with introduction, but still, if we need to write introduction, even if we want to start there, it's still quite a massive task. So a few pages of very relevant information, of very focused literature review is a difficult task. So this is where the way of writing through paragraphs, with paragraphs, might be useful. And this is all about breaking the
bigger picture down into individual points that we want to discuss within a given chapter. And good way of starting that process is just to sit with a blank piece of paper, just to come up with a few bullet points. And each bullet point represents a thought, represents a given topic that we need to discuss. So let's think about the introduction, and perhaps the first bullet point in the introduction, when you plan your introduction section, will be related to that bigger picture that we discussed before, right? So you want to introduce your reader into your field. So your first bullet point might be explanation of your field, of your field of science. And then the next one might be about stating the problem within that field, and so on and so on. So you just start by planning your section point by point. And if you end up with anything between, I don't know, 5 and 10 or maybe a dozen of points, I think that's already a very, very good start. And that gives you that skeleton, that template for the introduction. Of course, I'm mentioning introduction as an example, and this can be used to any other writing, discussion, methods, or even an email. But we want to focus on research papers here. So you start with a blank paper, you come up with a few bullet points which tell the story of that section. And I am coming back to telling the story because that's really important aspect of writing the paper. So with your bullet points, which you have on your paper, on a blank page, you are telling a story within that section. Okay, so that's the first point. Then the next point is really straightforward because you need to just replace each of those bullet points with a short paragraph, self-contained short paragraph. Okay. I find this process very useful. Perhaps as an engineer, I like to have a process. I like to have something to follow. But with, let's say, 10 bullet points, I can say, okay, each day I will write 2 paragraphs, and each day I will just replace 2 bullet points with 2 paragraphs. And that gives me something I can focus on. I can write this in the morning, and the rest of the day spend on other things. So it really gives me that chance to focus on something very specific, something I can write, I can deliver, and then I can move on. Okay, so we replace each paragraph with each bullet point with a paragraph. And it's important to remember that each paragraph should be self-contained. So each paragraph is telling within itself a small story about that bullet point which we just came up with. And with that, you are just building entire paper and individual sections step by step, almost like brick after brick, adding those bricks to your paper and just growing it with time. So it's important to have that time. It's important not to rush through that process. You cannot write a good paper within one day or even a week. You need to allow time. You want to spend some time on each of those bullet points and each of those paragraphs. You don't want to write 20 or 30 paragraphs in one day because the quality of that writing will be very, very poor. But if your task for each day, if you have enough time to write a paper, let's say a couple of weeks, maybe a month, then you can break this down into very small steps. Each day write maybe 1 paragraph, maybe 2, and with that you can be sure that quality will be there. Okay, I think that's enough in terms of theory behind building the paper with paragraphs. But let me give you some examples. And now let's focus on one individual paragraph. And this is something I took from my boys from their school. I've noticed at some point in their homework that they were discussing at school, primary school, how to write paragraphs in English, how to form a good paragraph. And this method is called P paragraphs, and P stands for point, evidence, and explanation. So in each paragraph, we should start with making a point. we should sum up the main idea that we want to present in our paragraph. And it can be only one sentence, just to make a point. Then we move on and we give some evidence to the point that we just made previously. And we can expand this to as much as long as possible as needed, but we want to give some evidence to support that point given at the beginning of the paragraph. And then we finish off that paragraph with giving some explanation and maybe giving some interpretation from us about that point, about that evidence, right? So we might answer the question, why the writer used given technique, why the quotation was important, why the result is important. So we want to finish off this paragraph and close that paragraph with an explanation. So if you make sure that each of your paragraphs starts with the point, then give an evidence, and then finish with explanation, this paragraph can be taken out from your paper and can be read as standalone piece of information. And this is what makes a good and successful paragraph, that it can be read as standalone piece of information. Right, so let me support that with an example. So here on that slide, you can see point, evidence, and explanation, again, based on a school example, but let's start with something simple so that we can just map this P paragraph method on this paragraph on the screen. So, of course, example from an English school. So we'll be talking about David Beckham, and in this paragraph, pupils at school are making a case and making a point that David Beckham should be considered as a national hero because he's been worked so hard to achieve his success. Okay, fair enough. So that's the point that we make at the beginning of our paragraph. So now we want to give some evidence. We want to expand on that point. We want to give some context to that information. So we might say that an example of this fact is that he started training at such a young age, and many of other children were still learning to read, and he was already learning to kick a football. Okay, so this is some sort of evidence for that point. And then we want to finish off that paragraph with an explanation, a bit of reflection. So we can say that this shows how important it is to have a clear goal in life and always work towards achieving. And that's it. With this explanation, the point is finished, the point is made, evidence is given, and we can move on to our next thought and our next point that we want to make. And step by step, paragraph by paragraph, we can build entire paper. Okay, I appreciate that was very simplistic example. So let's move on to a scientific example. So a recent paper from Science, and I picked up that example because I think those three sections of the P paragraph are very well visible in that paragraph. I think it was taken from the introduction section. So anyway, the authors of that paper, which is on gene therapy, please pay attention to the title of that paper, how short it is, only 5 words. So something we discussed yesterday, very, very short title in this Science paper. But anyway, the authors start the paragraph with making a point about gene therapy and just explaining that this type of therapy is bringing new treatment options to multiple fields of medicine. So very general point, very general statement, but clearly this is the point they want to make. And they move on to expand on that thought, and they give an evidence of that first point of gene therapies bringing new treatments, right? So they expand on that, and with that they of course refer to literature as well, and they support their statements with some references in the literature, which of course is crucial in the introduction section. And then they finish off with a final 2 sentences where they give some of explanation to that evidence. So again, I don't expect anyone to read through that entire paragraph, but what I think is useful is to look and read some of the good papers in good journals, in very good journals, and try to spot that structure, and just to try to appreciate what is the point, what is evidence, and what is explanation. And then, of course, start using that method of building paragraphs. And I appreciate that perhaps for many of you, it's nothing new. It's something that perhaps you already applied, but still, from the workshops that we run, we get feedback that this is actually a good reminder of how to write a good paragraph, and it's very useful, especially for writing research papers. Okay, let me One point I would like to mention here is that you don't want to lose that story and all the effort that you put into writing a paper by low quality language, right? So as a author, you need to make sure that your message is clear, that your story is clear, that your results are as strong as possible. And the language at the end of the day is only a way of expressing that. So if you need help with expression of your research, that's fine. You can seek that help, and there are many people that can help you with that. So don't be afraid to ask for that help, and seek that help if necessary. And of course, being very pragmatic, the paper can be rejected based on the language basis. So you need to make sure that the language is as good as possible when you submit to international journal. And yesterday I got a question about some help with editing text and some software packages that might help with corrections. And these are some examples that I collected for you. So I'm sure many of you are very familiar with Grammarly service. It's a paid service. It's a paid app. But it is very good in terms of helping with that simple proofreading. Of course, the Grammarly won't rewrite sentences for you, but can spot some simple mistakes with style and grammar in your writing. It's very easy to use. You can. What's good is that you can install the app in Word. You can install in your browser, in your email, so it will be working in the background. So each time you write something, it will come up and will suggest some changes. So I used that in the past and I found it quite useful. However, it's a paid service, so you would need to find some funding for that. I would like to mention about two other services, apps, if you like, Hemingway and a language tool, which you have on the slide with the website addresses there. And these are services which can help you to analyze individual paragraphs. I think they have also an option to upload larger documents. However, it's not so easy and straightforward to use. But anyway, I think both of those apps are a good start if you want to go for a simple analysis of your text in English. They will suggest some changes. They will make some suggestions. Hemingway is interesting in a way that it will also give you a score for your text, for your paragraph, in terms of clarity, in terms of how easy it is for a reader to understand your text. So I would encourage you to play with those apps. You can just copy a paragraph of text, paste this in those apps, and see how this works for you. So hopefully that answered the question that I had yesterday about some apps and programs for writing in English. Okay, so this is a slide on blank page syndrome, and I have to say this slide I produced that slide on a special request from a few PhD supervisors in the past. So those supervisors were saying that I have a problem with my PhD students because they don't know where to start. They know all the theory about writing the paper, but somehow they cannot get organized themselves, and they get lost, and they are not efficient in writing the paper. So with that suggestion, we came up with a list of a few tricks, if you like, how we as authors can trick ourselves into efficient writing. So let me just quickly go through those points and give you context and just explanation. I won't spend too much time on that. If you are interested in any of those techniques, you can easily Google that and follow this up. So the first, very straightforward, it's good to start just writing anything, right? It sounds so simple, but very often we just sit at the blank piece of paper like this, on this figure on the right, and we just try to figure out what to write, and we try to write something amazing, something excellent, something which will be ideal, and this is the trap, because then we cannot really start. We cannot start the process. So it's so important we just start writing anything, right? Just start writing anything on the subject, and later on you will have an opportunity to correct that if needed. But very simple trick, and very efficient. Right. The second one is just to give ourselves achievable, but some kind of target, daily or weekly target for writing. And a good example here from other writers, quite famous writers, international writers, is that it's enough just to write 2 crappy pages per day. Any crappy pages, 2 crappy pages per day will do, and that's already excellent progress. Again, you will have an opportunity to correct this later, but if you write something each day, that's great contribution. The third point is about separating sections of our paper from each other. So if you have the entire paper in your one, whether it's Word or any other text editor, but if you keep the entire paper in only one file, it can become quite difficult to manage that, and it's quite daunting. It's quite, you can, each time you open that file, you see just this huge task that is in front of you, and it doesn't help at all. So what really helps is to have separate files, separate file for introduction, separate file for results, for methods, for induction, and just sit to each file individually, and just on that day, just to focus on that particular file and that particular task that is in front of you. So if you are writing introduction section at a given day, just open that one file with introduction section, and don't think about results. Don't think about discussion. There's no time for this now. Just focus on introduction and just one file. Paragraphs, I think we discussed at length, important technique which can help you with efficient writing, but I don't want to go any further there. Leading domino, again, something you can Google. It's finding a task which you can perform as the first task in the morning, and after that task is completed, all other tasks later on will be much easier. Right, so you try to identify what will be most difficult. If I crack this in the morning, if it's done, then the rest will be much easier. So there will be always kind of leading domino in your process. Eat the Frog is all about completing the task which we don't want to complete as the first one. Right, so something we really try to avoid, something we don't want to do, something it's maybe difficult, but with that technique, if you do this first as a first task, a little bit similar to leading domino, but eating the frog first means that you are doing this task in the morning, it's done, and you can forget about that. So I encourage you to Google that. Very useful technique, Pomodoro technique, something I'm still using to this day. It's a simple trick where you work for 25 minutes and then you take 5 minutes break. Within that break, you go, you brew a tea, you play with your dog, you just look outside. Doesn't matter. You just need to change your state from work, from writing to something else. And the technique breaks this down into 25 minutes work, 5 minute break. Again, lots of literature on that in the internet, so you can read. And if you can concentrate on your work, that's great. But if you need some help, any concentration music is really good, really helpful. Again, to this day, I'm using some concentration music, and absolutely amazing in terms of isolating ourselves from the environment and helping us to focus on task at hand. So with all those techniques and all those methods, as you can see, we're trying to trick ourselves into being an efficient writer, because it is a difficult task to write a paper, and it takes time, and we need some help, and we need to trick ourselves a little bit into that process, so that it's becoming more efficient and maybe even fun. Okay, I think that's enough on those techniques, and I think the last part of that section, writing the paper, is about data presentation, about figures, and about graphs. And it's absolutely crucial part of publishing, effective publishing, because data presentation is something that can be very quickly spotted and very quickly assessed by reviewers, by editors, but also readers after the paper is published. So the quality of figures, graphs, sketches is absolutely crucial in academic publishing. So I'll give you just a few examples to kind of highlight the most important points that I think are important for you as a writer. So let's start with this simple diagram of experimental setup. So what I want to say and what I want to show with this slide is that it's much better to give even that simple diagram of experimental method comparing to a photograph of your setup, right? So any photo of your setup, even if it is done with a really good camera, it won't look good in the paper. There will be always some background. It might be printed badly. It's typically not a good idea to include photos of the entire setup and experimental equipment. Much better to come up with a simple diagram which you can highlight key pieces, key elements, and in terms of presentation, it's much better choice. So it can be an example like this one on the slide. It can be even very simplistic, kind of 2D, like this one here. But again, with all the legend that you can associate with that figure, it will be much easier for the reader to understand that method and appreciate what you are trying to show on that image. So this is about equipment, and moving on to data presentation in terms of results, in terms of numbers. So this is not so good example, but this is a typical product of Excel, right? So we have some background, we have random colors associated with our columns, we have some sort of legend on the side, and this is kind of automatic product of Excel. So what I want to say, and the point I want to make, is that what we should do is to look at those data points and try to improve that automatically produced image ourselves, right? So first of all, we can remove background, which won't look good when printed in black and white. We can add some error bars. Very important in any data presentation. We can group our data points. We can add some legend, right? So very simple, very simple tasks, very simple actions taken with that graph. By the way, this is the same set of data, right? Just presented in a different way. But in my opinion, in terms of presentation, in terms of quality, much better. And it will be appreciated by the editor, by reviewers, and will be recognized. So another example of Excel product, right? So some sort of potential measurement, a little bit of legend, but if you have a few measurements like that, maybe you can group all of them together. Maybe you can add some description, maybe with another layer of information, you can give some explanation of what's measured, and by putting 4 of those together, this image tells a story, much better story than the previous one. And it's also so much easier to discuss and describe that figure in your discussion, and analyze it and highlight those most important features. So very simple trick, but very efficient. And I think the final example of Excel product, right? We've seen all those, we all saw those graphs and figures. But here is an example again of just spending a little while on a figure, trying to add another layers to that figure, add some arrows, some explanations, some critical values, a bit of description, and suddenly this graph is becoming so much more in terms of value of information. And again, for us, so much easier to write a meaningful discussion of that graph. So these were very simplistic examples from some of my previous papers, but it's always good to be to look at best examples in the field, and we can do that, right? We can look at some of the best journals. So this example from Nature Reviews, Microbiology, and a beautiful picture of the representation of the entire experiment, of the entire measurement process, and the entire approach used in that paper, right? So of course, I'm not saying that all of us should be drawing this type of figures, but I think in terms of inspiration, it's really useful to understand where we could be going with data presentation. So another example from another journal, a slightly different approach, right? So here we just see a mixture of different measurements and different approaches, different methods, but this entire figure really tells a story. It could be perhaps even used as a graphical abstract for that paper. So very, very attractive in terms of telling the story. Or even simple simple actions like here, just adding a few bubbles, just adding a few trends, like even this graph in the bottom right corner, just adding the boundaries of the measurement with a few labels, already making that graph much more attractive and easier to interpret. So with that discussion of data presentation, I just wanted again to make sure that you just don't accept automatically what you get from Excel or any other software that you use, but you just look critically at your own figures and you try to reflect on them and try to understand how you can present them slightly better, how you can improve them, how you can add another layer to the figure so that it's easier for the reader to interpret and for you to describe. So with that, looks like we are bang on halfway through our time. So again, as yesterday, Ali, I would suggest that perhaps we would take 5 minutes break.
Okay, Doctor.
Just to stretch a little bit. And I wanted to leave everyone just with a note of something I discussed yesterday. So if you are interested in anything that we discuss in terms of helping with your paper, or if your institution is interested in organizing any webinars or workshops, that's the left-hand side of that slide. Please get in touch with me. And for anyone working in engineering area, material science, materials in general, just a reminder about the free webinar on 25th. It really will be a treat with a webinar from Professor Andrzej Wojewodin. You don't want to miss that. It's only 60 minutes webinar, but it will be absolutely fascinating. So I encourage you to register. So can we leave
Okay,
it
Doctor.
like that, Ali, for 5 minutes or so?
So okay, we will have 5 minutes from now. Would you like to go through questions before you start, or you want to resume till the end?
If we could do like yesterday, so when we could come back, we can go for some questions. That would be helpful.
Okay. See you in 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome. الأخوة الأعزاء الآن وقت بريك لمدة 5 دقائق ونعود إن شاء الله. 5 minutes break, then we will be back. Hello, everyone. Shall we start?
Yes, please.
Okay, we will go through some questions in the question and answer session. I will try to group these questions. Many questions about the website, either about free websites to check our paper, or is there also any websites for open access journal list that will list all of them? And also, is there any journal website for paid publishing journals? So this kind of questions also came.
Okay. So I guess the good website here will be SciMago website, which I described yesterday. This is really a website which captures all the journals, and we can very easy find our field of research, and we will get a list of all the journals divided into Q1, Q2, 3, and 4, and with full description in terms of wherever they are open or not open, and their addresses. So SciMago is, I would say, really good source for comparing different journals in the same field.
Okay. Is there any difference between each index between Google Scholar, Scopus, Clarivate?
Yes, there is, and it's a good question. So this really depends on what the way of calculation, and Google Scholar tends to give a higher H index because Google Scholar is taking into account broader spectrum of papers, maybe some conference papers, maybe some papers which are repeated. So in terms of quality of data within Google Scholar, it's much broader, and with that, of course, the H index is higher. While Scopus, for example, is very well maintained, and it's only the journal papers which are used for calculations, and Scopus tends to give smaller H index.
Okay. Some questions came about the introduction part. So the first one says, is it okay to include references or literature review in the introduction? Another question says, when I collect the data from different sources about my search problem, how can I defend some points of view? And is it okay still in that part?
Okay, so the first part of the question about references in introduction. So that's absolutely what we should be doing. We should be using as many references as possible in terms of relation to literature. That's the purpose of literature review, just explaining the state of the art. And of course, we can only do this by citing all relevant research. So absolutely, within introduction, well, again, I don't want to put a number on this, but if you really push me, I mean, at least 20 references should be included in kind of standard research papers, because that's really the number from which you can get a good overview of the field. But as I said before, it's not about quantity, it's about quality of those references. It's more important than a number. And sorry, the second part of the question, I didn't really get that clearly. So this is more about
I think about should I defend my point of view? He said I will correct my from different sources to clarify my research problem. Then should I defend at this time, or
so
if I understand too? I'm sorry.
Okay, this is again related to introduction. Yeah. Okay. So I guess I know what the question is about. So it's about, I guess, how to show different points of view on the same topic from different resources and different references. And well, actually, this is what makes a good introduction. really, when we are able to show those different point of views and we are able to explain that we understand those differences and we understand that this group came up with that approach, the other group came up with another approach, we understand how different they are, which one is working in what conditions, maybe wherever one is better or the another. So really introduction is that place that we can show that understanding and we can show different points of view. So we absolutely should be doing that.
Okay. Two questions came about what is called IMRAD applicable to all fields of scientific research. I'm not sure if you get it, Doctor. IMRAD system. Do you know about it? And is it okay to be included in the abstract, according to one of the questions?
Wherever IMRAD can be used in abstract.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good that's again good question, because whoever asked that question, that's a good point, because abstract, we mentioned about 5 points that we should be going through the abstract, but if you think about those 4 points, they are actually going into similar shape as our IMRAD. We start a bit broader in terms of explaining the context of our research, right? We said 50 words, 40-50 words to give a context, and this is really that first part of IMRAD. Then we go into explaining what we've done and why, and then we finish off again with a bigger picture. So it's a good way of thinking about abstract in terms of IMRAD and that shape. I agree with that.
Okay. Again, questions about the journals. One of the questions says some journals ask about data sharing. Data sharing. You have any idea about that? And is it another question about journals? They said why many people prefer to submit in closed access journals. What do you think about that?
Okay, so data sharing, indeed, more and more publishers and journals are now encourage authors to, apart from submitting the paper, also submit a data sets or so background data information. And this is now becoming possible because all papers are stored online and we can access them easily, not only the paper, but also data associated with that. So I think it is quite useful because it's also evidence of our research, and we can also get some exposure from sharing data. So it's very individual decision, and not many journals, I have to say, allow for sharing data. But when it's possible, I would certainly consider that, because that gives me more exposure, that gives me more opportunity to share my work. So of course that's good outcome. And the second question was about publishing in the closed system, or in a traditional way, with the paid access, right? So I think the most perhaps the first reason is that it's free. Yes, we can submit and we don't need to pay any fees. And then paper is revised, is accepted, hopefully, and that's ends of the story. We don't need to pay anything. So this is why I guess that's the main reason. We don't have that upfront cost.
Okay, 2 questions I try to combine in the results or discussion part of the paper. Some questions said, do really is really my results has to convince the readers very well. Also, maybe is there also another questions about discussion? He says one of the students asking that my advisor told me to write down the interpretation and the results rather than the discussion, which means he clarify his results rather than to discuss it in another discussion section. So what is your idea about these two?
Yes, so Today we discussed IMRAD's structure, and within that structure the results are sitting separately to discussion, right? Because then we can clearly describe those two sections. But there is nothing wrong in connecting those two sections and writing results together with discussion. But what we need to make sure is that even if those two sections are connected, there is still meaningful discussion in the paper. So if you remember that slide where we had two sections of the slide, and it was simple description and interpretation, we want to have that deep interpretation and discussion of the results, even if it is within one section. That's fine. It's just the label. But what is important is content. So that content has to be there in terms of in-depth analysis and interpretation of the results. That can be done within the same section. That's fine.
Yeah.
The problem is the problem is when the section is called results and discussion, but really there are only results and there is no discussion there. This is when the journal will spot that, and there will be a problem.
Yeah, okay. With the clarification, thanks a lot. Maybe last two questions because we want you to resume. Scholars or staff in humanities, in humanities disciplines, find really big problems in publishing in ISI journals or what do they call it, classified journals. Do you have any idea or advice for them, especially for non-English research?
Yeah, this is very well known challenge for those colleagues working in those fields internationally, really.
Okay.
Even if you recall that table which I showed with mean impact factors for different fields, the humanities and social science was really at the bottom there, which means that there are less journals and there are less cited papers and journals. And I'm afraid there's not good answer. This is just the nature.
And the problem is complicated for Arabic research, not even in English.
Yeah, I see the same problem in Poland, where I work quite a lot, and it's absolutely the same problem, unfortunately.
Okay. Maybe last quick questions. Is there any difference between research paper and PhD thesis?
Right. So PhD thesis gives an opportunity to expand much more in terms of the ideas, in terms of description, than the paper. Paper has to be relatively short, typically 5,000 words, 7,000 words maximum for a research paper, and with the thesis, we can go to tens of thousands of words. So that's the main difference. But in some countries, Sweden, for example, is such country. They require PhD students to write papers instead of PhD thesis. So within the PhD project, the student will write maybe 5 or 6 papers, and then the students will take those papers together and present as a book, and that book is a PhD thesis, which is an interesting approach. So I would say that from a good thesis, you would get more than one paper, maybe 2 or 3 papers from a good PhD thesis, and that's the main difference, right? That PhD paper, the research paper is focused on one problem, small problem, and PhD thesis is much broader.
Okay. Okay, thanks, Doctor. So I think it's better now to continue for maximum 1 hour or less than that. So we'll have another 10 minutes before 10 p.m.
Great. All right. Great. Thank you, Ali, again for handling the questions, and let's move on. Right. Okay. So let's move on now to the next section, and let's discuss the process of submitting the paper and collaborating with the publisher and with the journal. So let's stop here for a minute and let's reflect where we are at this point, so that we are on the same page. Okay, so we went through the process of planning the paper, and we went through the process of writing the paper, and we finally have a final manuscript ready, right? So perhaps this manuscript went through a number of revisions. Let's say it's the 14th revision that we are happy to submit. It's been proofread, maybe it's been language edited. The figures are perfect, the graphs are excellent. We wrote a fabulous introduction